In the shadowed halls of Greystone Manor, a single cry shatters the night Sir Reginald Harrow is dead, poisoned. A cryptic note clutched in his hand, the agent moves at midnight. Trust no one. Who among the elegant guests, Captain Langley, Mrs. Cresswell? The mysterious Mr. Drake hides a deadly secret. Why does a torn blue shawl and a crushed rose petal point to betrayal? Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of lies, greed, and murder. Can she expose the killer and a hidden double agent before the truth slips away? Step into a classic mystery where every clue counts, and no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. The gathering at Greystone Hall. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over Greystone Hall, a sprawling Georgian manor nestled in the Dorset countryside, its ivy-clad walls glowing with an air of timeless dignity. The estate, owned by the enigmatic Sir Reginald Harrow, was a place of whispered secrets and old money, its vast lawns and rose gardens masking tensions that simmered beneath its polished surface. On this particular August afternoon in 1952, the hall buzzed with the arrival of guests for a weekend retreat, a gathering Sir Reginald had cryptically billed as a matter of national importance. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the corner of the grand drawing room, adjusted her lace shawl and sipped her tea, her sharp blue eyes flitting over the assembled company. She had been invited not by Sir Reginald, but by her old friend, Lady Beatrice Harrow, the baronet's sister, who had written to St. Mary Mead with an air of urgency. "Jane, dear." The letter had read, "Something is amiss at Greystone. I need your quiet wisdom." Miss Marple, ever discreet, had packed her knitting and arrived by the midday train, blending into the background as only she could. The drawing room was a study in contrasts. The polished mahogany furniture gleamed under the chandelier's glow, while the guests' polite smiles barely concealed their unease. Sir Reginald, a weary man in his late 50s with a clipped military mustache, stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid as he addressed the room. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "this weekend is no mere social affair. We are here to discuss matters of utmost secrecy, matters that could shape the future of our nation." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, her face a mask of mild interest, though her mind catalogued every detail. Opposite her sat Captain Arthur Langley, a retired naval officer with a weathered face and a habit of tapping his cigarette case nervously. Beside him was Mrs. Evelyn Cresswell, a glamorous widow in her 40s, her emerald necklace catching the light as she laughed too loudly at Sir Reginald's words. Dr. Hugh Mortimer, a bespectacled scientist with ink-stained fingers, fidgeted with his pocket watch, while his young assistant, Miss Clara Vance, scribbled notes with a frown. Rounding out the party were Mr. Victor Grayson, a suave Foreign Office official with a penchant for cryptic remarks, and his wife, Mrs. Diana Grayson, whose cool beauty seemed at odds with her anxious glances toward her husband. Lady Beatrice, perched on a velvet settee, caught Miss Marple's eye and gave a slight nod, as if to confirm her earlier fears. The final guest, introduced as Mr. Julian Drake, was a late arrival, a tall, dark-haired man in his 30s with a disarming smile and an accent that hinted at time spent abroad. He carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to scrutiny, yet his eyes darted about the room, assessing each face. The conversation turned to pleasantries, but Miss Marple noted the undercurrents. Captain Langley's curt dismissal of Mr. Grayson's political quip, Mrs. Cresswell's overly familiar hand on Mr. Drake's arm, and Dr. Mortimer's muttered comment about reckless ambition as he glanced at Sir Reginald. The clock on the mantel struck 5, and the butler, Mr. Perkins, announced dinner. As the guests rose, Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag, her mind already weaving connections. In her experience, such gatherings polished on the surface often hid darker truths. Dinner was a lavish affair in the oak-paneled dining room, with candlelight casting shadows on the ancestral portraits. Sir Reginald presided at the head of the table, his conversation dominated by veiled references to a traitor in our midst. Miss Marple, seated between Lady Beatrice and Miss Vance, listened intently. "It's all rather theatrical, isn't it?" Miss Vance whispered, her voice tinged with amusement. "Sir Reginald loves his mysteries." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied softly, her eyes on Sir Reginald's clenched fist. "But mysteries have a way of becoming real, my dear." As the meal progressed, the tension grew palpable. Mr. Grayson questioned Mr. Drake about his recent travels, his tone sharp. Mrs. Cresswell dropped her fork with a clatter. When Sir Reginald mentioned classified documents, Captain Langley, red-faced from wine, muttered about disloyalty in high places. By the time dessert was served, the air was thick with unspoken accusations. At precisely 9:47 p.m., as recorded by Dr. Mortimer's ever-present pocket watch, a sharp cry pierced the room. The guests froze. Perkins, the butler, rushed in, his face ashen. "Sir Reginald," he gasped. He's collapsed in the study." The party surged toward the study, Miss Marple following at a measured pace. There, slumped over his desk, lay Sir Reginald Harrow, a glass of brandy spilled. Beside him, his face was contorted, his eyes wide with shock. Dr. Mortimer knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse, then shook his head grimly. "He's dead," he said. "Poison, I'd wager." A stunned silence fell, broken only by Mrs. Cresswell's stifled sob. Miss Marple, standing quietly by the bookshelf, noted the open window, the faint scent of bitter almonds, and the single sheet of paper clutched in Sir Reginald's hand. Her eyes narrowed. The game, as she often thought of it, had begun. Chapter 2. The shadow of Tressant's study at Greystone Hall was a scene frozen in time. The air heavy with the acrid tang of spilled brandy and the faint, sinister trace of bitter almonds. Sir Reginald Harrow's body remained slumped over his desk, his lifeless hand still clutching a crumpled sheet of paper. The guests crowded near the doorway, their faces a gallery of shock, fear, and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, standing unobtrusively by the bookshelf, observed the chaos with her usual calm, her sharp eyes darting from face to face, noting every fleeting expression. Mrs. Evelyn Cresswell's sob had given way to a trembling silence, her emerald necklace glinting as she clutched Captain Langley's arm for support. The captain, his withered face pale, muttered something about damned foul play. Dr. Hugh Mortimer, still kneeling beside the body, adjusted his spectacles and examined the glass of brandy with a frown. "Cyanide, almost certainly," he said, his voice clinical but unsteady. "The smell is unmistakable." Mr. Victor Grayson, the Foreign Office official, stepped forward, his polished demeanor fraying at the edges. "We mustn't touch anything," he said sharply. "This is a crime scene. Perkins, fetch the police at once." The butler, Mr. Perkins, nodded and hurried out, his footsteps echoing in the grand hall. Miss Clara Vance, Dr. Mortimer's assistant, stood apart, her notebook clutched tightly, her eyes wide with something that looked less like fear and more like calculation. Mr. Julian Drake, the late arrival, leaned against the doorframe, his disarming smile gone, replaced by a guarded intensity. Mrs. Diana Grayson, her cool beauty now strained, whispered to her husband, Victor, "This is madness. Who could have done this?" Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the crumpled paper in Sir Reginald's hand. She stepped forward, her small figure almost overlooked in the commotion, and said softly, "Might I suggest, Mr. Grayson, that we preserve that document? It may hold some significance." Grayson hesitated, then nodded. "With a handkerchief," He carefully extracted the paper and unfolded it on the desk, revealing a single line scrawled in Sir Reginald's precise hand. The agent moves at midnight. Trust no one. A murmur rippled through the room. Captain Langley's cigarette case clattered to the floor, and he stooped to retrieve it, his hands shaking. Mrs. Cresswell gasped, "A double agent?" Here Lady Beatrice, standing near Miss Marple, touched her friend's arm. "Jane, this is what I feared," she whispered. Reginald was obsessed with some secret project. He spoke of betrayal, but I thought it was his nerves. Miss Marple's knitting needles, retrieved from her bag, clicked rhythmically as she replied, "Nerves, my dear Beatrice, do not conjure poison from thin air. This was no accident." The local police arrived within the hour, led by Inspector Crawley, a stout man with a no-nonsense air and a mustache that rivaled Sir Reginald's. He surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, ordering his constable to secure the study and questioning the guests. Briefly, "No one leaves the estate," he declared, "until we know more. You're all under suspicion." The guests were ushered back to the drawing room, where a fire had been lit to ward off the evening chill. Miss Marple settled into her corner, her knitting a quiet counterpoint to the rising tension. Inspector Crawley began his inquiries, starting with Perkins, who recounted the evening's events with precision. Sir Reginald had retired to the study alone at 9:30 p.m. after dinner to review some papers. The brandy decanter, Perkins insisted, had been untouched when he last checked it at 8 o'clock p.m. Anyone could have tampered with it after that, Captain Langley interjected, lighting another cigarette. "The decanter was on the sideboard all evening." "Quite so," said Dr. Mortimer, his voice dry. "But cyanide acts quickly. Whoever poisoned him did so just before he drank." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Dr. Mortimer," she said mildly, "you seem well-versed in poisons. Is cyanide a common choice?" The scientist flushed. "I've studied toxicology. Yes, it's fast and effective, but not subtle. Whoever used it wanted Sir Reginald dead immediately." Inspector Crawley turned to Mr. Drake. "You, sir, you arrived late today. Where were you before dinner?" Drake's smile returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "In London, on business. I caught the 3:15 train to Dorset. Arrived at Greystone just before 6. "And your business?" the inspector pressed. "Private matters," Drake replied smoothly. "I deal in information, Inspector. Discretion is my trade." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing, her attention shifting to Mrs. Cresswell, who was twisting her handkerchief. "It's dreadful," the widow murmured. "Sir Reginald was so intense tonight. That talk of traitors, it unsettled us all." "Indeed," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet, Mrs. Cresswell, you seemed quite at ease with Mr. Drake earlier. Old friends, perhaps?" Mrs. Cresswell's cheeks pinked. "We've met before, yes, at a charity gala in London. Nothing more." The inspector moved on, but Miss Marple filed away the widow's hesitation. She noted, too, the way Mr. Grayson's hand lingered on his wife's shoulder, as if to steady her or to warn her. Miss Vance, meanwhile, had resumed scribbling in her notebook, her pen moving furiously. As the clock struck midnight, Inspector Crawley dismissed the guests to their rooms, warning them to remain on the estate. Miss Marple lingered, catching Lady Beatrice's eye. "Beatrice, dear," she said quietly, "might I see Sir Reginald's study again? I find details so clarifying." With the inspector's reluctant permission, Miss Marple and Lady Beatrice returned to the study. The body had been removed, but the scene remained untouched. Miss Marple's gaze swept over the desk, the open window, the brandy decanter. She paused at the window, noting a faint scuff mark on the sill. "Curious," she murmured, her fingers brushing the frame. This window was opened recently, but the night is warm. Why open it at all? Lady Beatrice shivered. Jane, do you think a double agent, as Reginald wrote? Could it be one of us? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. My dear, in a village like St. Mary Mead, one learns that secrets are rarely as grand as they seem. But this feels like a betrayal dressed in finer clothes. As they left the study, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the evening's fragments, the cryptic note, the scuff mark, the widow's blush, the scientist's knowledge, the stranger's evasiveness. Someone in this house had played a deadly game, and Miss Marple intended to unravel it. Chapter 3. The arrival of Miss Marple's inside morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Greystone Hall, casting long shadows across the breakfast room where the guests gathered in uneasy silence. The clink of porcelain and the rustle of newspapers did little to mask the tension that hung over the table like a fog. Sir Reginald Harrow's death the previous night had transformed the manor from a place of guarded secrets to one of outright suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the far end with a cup of tea and her ever-present knitting, observed the scene with her customary quiet alertness, her eyes as sharp as the needles in her hands. Lady Beatrice, pale but composed, presided over the table, though her attempts at polite conversation fell flat. Captain Arthur Langley, his cigarette case absent this morning, stared into his coffee, his jaw tight. Mrs. Evelyn Cresswell, her glamour subdued by a simple black dress, toyed with a piece of toast, her eyes darting nervously toward Mr. Julian Drake, who sat opposite her, reading a newspaper with studied nonchalance. Dr. Hugh Mortimer and his assistant, Miss Clara Vance, spoke in low tones, their heads bent together, while Mr. Victor Grayson and his wife, Mrs. Diana Grayson, exchanged terse whispers. The butler, Mr. Perkins, moved silently, refilling teacups with a deference that seemed strained. Miss Marple had not been invited to Greystone Hall by chance, though her presence was treated as incidental by most of the guests. Lady Beatrice had confided in her late the previous night, after the police had retreated, that Sir Reginald's cryptic talk of a double agent was tied to his work with a covert government committee. He was obsessed, Jane, Beatrice had said, her voice trembling. He believes someone close to him was leaking secrets. I thought it paranoia. But now, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she recalled the conversation. She had not yet shared her observations about the scuff mark on the study's windowsill, or the faint trace of mud she'd noticed on the rug nearby. Details the police had overlooked in their haste. Inspector Crawley, competent but unimaginative, had spent the morning questioning the staff and was now in the library, poring over Sir Reginald's papers with a constable Dot as breakfast concluded. Miss Marple rose, her small figure drawing little attention, and excused herself to take the air in the garden. In truth, she wished to examine the exterior of the study window. Slipping through the French doors, she made her way along the gravel path, her sensible shoes crunching softly. The study's window faced a secluded corner of the rose garden. Shielded by a high yew hedge, she knelt, her knees protesting only slightly, and studied the ground beneath the sill. There, in the soft earth, was a faint imprint of partial shoe mark, too small for a man's boot, but too deliberate for a gardener's tread. Nearby, a single rose petal lay crushed, its edges browning as if trodden upon hours ago. Curious, Miss Marple murmured, straightening. She glanced up at the window, noting its low height easily accessible to someone agile. Her mind flickered to the guests, Mrs. Cresswell's nervous grace, Miss Vance's youthful energy, Mrs. Grayson's quiet strength. Any of them could have climbed through. But why, returning to the house, Miss Marple found Inspector Crawley in the hall, his face grim. Miss Marple, he said, his tone polite but dismissive. I trust you're keeping out of trouble. Oh, quite, Inspector, she replied, her eyes twinkling. But I wonder if you've considered the window in the study. It was open last night, you know, and the ground beneath shows signs of disturbance. Crawley's mustache twitched. The window. We noted it was open, but Sir Reginald might have opened it himself. No need to complicate things. Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly. But in St. Mary Mead, we find that small details like a crushed rose petal often tell a larger story. The inspector grunted, unconvinced, and excused himself to continue his interviews. Miss Marple made her way to the drawing room, where Lady Beatrice was arranging flowers with a distracted air. Jane, you've been poking about, haven't you? Beatrice said, managing a faint smile. What have you found? Nothing conclusive, dear, Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair. But I am curious about Mr. Drake. He arrived so late yesterday, and Sir Reginald's note mentioned a midnight meeting. Do you know much about him? Beatrice hesitated. Only that Reginald invited him personally. Something about his work brought intelligence, I think. Reginald trusted him. But, well, you heard the note. Trust no one. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. Her thoughts turned to the other guests. Captain Langley's nervous tics suggested a man haunted by more than grief. Mrs. Cresswell's familiarity with Drake hinted at a shared history, despite her denials. Dr. Mortimer's expertise in poisons was convenient, perhaps too convenient. And Miss Vance's notebook, filled with cryptic shorthand, was a puzzle in itself. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple joined Lady Beatrice in the library, where the guests were summoned for informal questioning by Inspector Crawley. The inspector, seated at a large oak table, was grilling Mr. Grayson about his foreign office connections. Sir Reginald mentioned classified documents. Crawley said, "You'd know about those, wouldn't you?" Grayson's smile was tight. Ideal. In diplomacy, Inspector, not espionage. Reginald's work was outside my purview. Mrs. Grayson, seated beside him, added softly, "My husband is discreet, Inspector. If he knew anything, he'd have told Sir Reginald directly." Miss Marple's eyes flickered to Mrs. Grayson's hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. A faint smudge of dirt marred her cuff, a detail so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. "Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple said gently, "you're fond of the rose garden, aren't you? I saw you there yesterday, admiring the blooms." Mrs. Grayson started, then nodded. "Yes, I find it calming." "Why do you ask?" "No reason," Miss Marple said, her voice as soft as her knitting. But her mind was alight with possibilities. The rose petal, the shoe mark, the smudged cuff, small threads, but in St. Mary Mead, such threads often wove a tapestry of truth. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple remained silent, her presence unassuming but her thoughts relentless. Sir Reginald's death was no random act. It was a calculated move in a game of deception. And Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was determined to uncover the player behind it. Chapter 4. The questions deepened. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Greystone Hall's library, casting a soft glow on the rows of leather-bound books and the tense faces of the guests. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the lingering unease of Sir Reginald Harrow's murder. Inspector Crawley, his notebook open and his mustache bristling with determination, had set up a makeshift interrogation space at the library's oak table, where he now questioned each guest in turn. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, appeared to be absorbed in her knitting, but her sharp blue eyes missed nothing, and her ears caught every word. The inspector's approach was methodical but heavy-handed, his questions probing alibis and motives with a bluntness that set the guests on edge. Miss Marple, however, preferred a subtler method. She had already noted the smudged cuff on Mrs. Diana Grayson's sleeve, the crushed rose petal beneath the study window, and the partial shoe mark in the garden. These were fragments, not yet a picture, but in her experience, such fragments always led to the truth. Captain Arthur Langley was the first to face Crawley's scrutiny. The retired naval officer sat stiffly, his weathered hands clasped tightly. "I was in the billiard room after dinner," he said, his voice gruff, "playing a solitary game. Perkins can confirm he saw me there at 9:15. And after that," Crawley pressed, his pen poised. Langley hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the window. "I stepped out for a smoke on the terrace. Round 9:30, I'd say. Alone." Miss Marple's needles paused. The terrace was adjacent to the rose garden, mere steps from the study window. She made a mental note, her face betraying nothing. Next was Mrs. Evelyn Cresswell, who entered the library with a theatrical sigh, her black dress accentuating her pallor. "I was in the drawing room, chatting with Mr. Drake," she said, her voice trembling just enough to draw sympathy. "We were discussing, music, I think, until that dreadful cry." Mr. Julian Drake, questioned shortly after, confirmed her story with his usual charm. "Mrs. Cresswell and I were indeed together," he said, his dark eyes meeting the inspector's without flinching. "I found her company delightful, as always." Miss Marple's lips twitched slightly. The ease of their mutual alibi was almost too perfect, and she recalled Mrs. Cresswell's blush when questioned about Drake the previous night. There was a history there, she was certain, though whether it was romantic or conspiratorial remained unclear. Dr. Hugh Mortimer and Miss Clara Vance were questioned together, their professional partnership evident in their synchronized responses. "We were in the conservatory, discussing my research," Mortimer said, adjusting his spectacles. Clara was taking notes. "We heard the cry and rushed to the study." Miss Vance nodded, clutching her notebook. It was 9:47, according to Dr. Mortimer's watch. "I always note the time." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the notebook, its pages filled with shorthand she couldn't decipher from her seat. "Miss Vance," she said gently, as if making idle conversation, "you must have a keen eye for detail. Writing so diligently, do you ever sketch, perhaps, maps or layouts?" The young woman blinked. Caught off guard, sketch, no, I just take notes for Dr. Mortimer. Scientific observations, mostly. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. But she filed away the girl's unease, wondering what those pages might conceal. Mr. Victor Grayson and his wife, Diana, were the last to be questioned. Grayson's Foreign Office polish held firm, though his answers were clipped. "Diana and I retired to our room after dinner, around 9:20. He said. "We were there until the commotion." Double quotes. Mrs. Grayson nodded, her expression serene, but her hands still clasped tightly. "I was feeling unwell," she said softly. "A headache. Victor stayed with me." Inspector Crawley scribbled notes, seemingly satisfied, but Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the smudge on Mrs. Grayson's cuff. A headache was a convenient excuse, and the rose garden was far from their guest room. She resolved to speak with Lady Beatrice about the couple's habits. As the interviews concluded, Crawley announced that the police would search the guests' rooms for evidence, particularly traces of cyanide or related substances. The announcement drew sharp protests. Captain Langley muttered about invasion of privacy, while Mrs. Cresswell clutched her necklace as if it might be confiscated. Miss Marple, however, remained silent, her mind turning over the alibis. Most placed the guests elsewhere at 9:30, when Sir Reginald retired to his study, but the poison's rapid action suggested it was administered close to 9:47. The window, The scuff mark and the rose petal pointed to an external approach, yet the brandy decanter was inside. A contradiction, but one that intrigued her. She approached Lady Beatrice, who was arranging books to calm her nerves. "Beatrice, dear," Miss Marple said quietly. "Did Sir Reginald keep cyanide in the house for his work? Perhaps." Beatrice frowned. "Not that I know of, Jane. But he had a laboratory in the East Wing chemicals for his experiments. Dr. Mortimer used it too, for his research." "You don't think?" "I think very little, yet," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But I should like to see that laboratory, if the inspector permits." With Crawley's grudging approval, Miss Marple accompanied Lady Beatrice to the East Wing, where a small, cluttered laboratory held shelves of bottles, beakers, and scientific instruments. Dr. Mortimer, summoned to explain the contents, pointed out various chemicals, his tone defensive. "These are for my work on agricultural compounds," he said. "Nothing here is cyanide, I assure you." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze lingering on a bottle labeled potassium ferrocyanide. "Harmless, according to Dr. Mortimer," but she recalled from a St. Mary Mead chemist that such compounds could be altered under certain conditions. She made a note to inquire further, perhaps through a discreet letter to her nephew's friend, a chemist in London. As they left the laboratory, Miss Marple paused by a window overlooking the rose garden. The view confirmed her earlier observation. The study was visible, its window easily accessible. She turned to Lady Beatrice. "Tell me, dear, did Mrs. Grayson often walk in the garden alone?" Beatrice hesitated. "Diana, she's fond of roses. Yes, I saw her there yesterday evening, before dinner. She seemed preoccupied." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm as they returned to the library. The alibis were too neat. The motives too tangled. Sir Reginald's note about a double agent suggested espionage, but Miss Marple knew that betrayal often wore a more personal masquerade, jealousy, or revenge. She would watch and listen and let the threads of truth unravel in their own time. Chapter 6, a clue in detail. Late afternoon light bathed Greystone Hall in a soft amber glow, but the warmth did little to ease the chill of suspicion that had settled over its inhabitants. The guests, confined to the manor by Inspector Crawley's orders, moved restlessly between the drawing room and the library, their polite facades fraying under the strain of scrutiny. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting, appeared as serene as ever, but her mind was a whirlwind of connections, piecing together the fragments she had gathered: the scuff mark on the study's windowsill, the crushed rose petal, the scrap of blue fabric, and the smudge of dirt on Mrs. Grayson's cuff. The police had concluded their second search of the study, finding no trace of cyanide in the brandy decanter, but confirming that the glass itself bore the telltale scent of bitter almonds. Inspector Crawley, growing frustrated, had begun to focus on Captain Langley, whose solitary smoke on the terrace placed him near the study at the critical time. The captain's defensive bluster only fueled the inspector's suspicions. But Miss Marple was not so easily swayed. In her experience, the loudest protests often masked fear rather than guilt. As the guests gathered for tea in the drawing room, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small but telling detail. Miss Clara Vance, Dr. Mortimer's assistant, sat at a writing desk, her notebook open as she scribbled furiously. Her pen paused, and she glanced nervously toward the door where Mr. Julian Drake stood, speaking in low tones with Mrs. Evelyn Cresswell. The widow's laughter was bright but brittle, and Drake's smile seemed more calculated than genuine. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she noted the exchange, her thoughts returning to Clara's notebook. What was the girl writing so diligently? And why did she guard it so closely, Miss Vance? Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. As she approached the young woman, you must find this all very trying. Keeping such meticulous notes, even now. Are they for Dr. Mortimer's research? Clara started, closing her notebook with a snap. Oh, yes, Miss Marple, she said quickly. Just observations. Dr. Mortimer likes me to be thorough. Of course, Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a young lady who kept a diary. She wrote in code, you know, to keep her secrets safe. Your shorthand reminds me of her. Clara's cheeks flushed. It's not a code, just shorthand. For efficiency, Miss Marple nodded, her expression benign. But her mind was alert. The girl's defensiveness was a clue in itself, and she resolved to find a way to glimpse those pages. As she returned to her seat, she overheard Captain Langley arguing with Mr. Victor Grayson near the fireplace. It's nonsense. Grayson, Langley snapped, his cigarette case clicking open and shut. You're the one with Foreign Office ties if anyone knew what Reginald was up to. It's you. Grayson's jaw tightened, but his voice remained smooth. Captain, your accusations are tiresome. I had no quarrel with Sir Reginald. My work is diplomatic, not clandestine. Mrs. Diana Grayson, standing nearby, touched her husband's arm. Victor, please. This is no time for arguments. Her pale blue shawl, draped over her shoulders, caught Miss Marple's eye. It matched the scrap of fabric from the rose garden, perfectly a delicate silk, easily torn on a thorn. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by Lady Beatrice, who approached with a worried frown. Jane, the inspector wants to question the staff again, but I'm afraid they're too shaken to be of much use. Perkins says he saw nothing unusual, but he's been odd since last night. Odd, dear? Miss Marple asked, her needles pausing. He's been jumpy, Beatrice said, not himself. I thought it was grief, but now I wonder. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the butler's trembling hands during tea. She decided to speak with him herself, under the guise of requesting more wool from the village. She found Perkins in the pantry, polishing silver with a distracted air. Mr. Perkins, she said kindly, you've had a dreadful shock. Sir Reginald was fortunate to have such a loyal man in his service. Perkins's hands stilled, and he met her gaze briefly before looking away. Thank you, madam. It's been a blow. I imagine so, Miss Marple said. You must see everything in a house like this. Did you notice anyone near the study before Sir Reginald retired last night? Or perhaps someone in the rose garden? Perkins hesitated, his fingers tightening on the cloth. The rose garden. I saw Mrs. Grayson there. Before dinner. She was alone, picking a rose. But no one later, madam. Miss Marple smiled. Thank you, Perkins. You've been most helpful. As she returned to the drawing room, her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion. Inspector Crawley had entered, holding a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. We found this in the rose garden, just below the study window, he announced, unwrapping a silver cigarette lighter. Engraved with the initials A.L. Captain Langley's face drained of color. That's mine, he stammered. But I must have dropped it during my smoke on the terrace. Convenient, Crawley said, his tone skeptical. It was half buried in the soil, Captain. Care to explain? Langley's protests grew louder, drawing the attention of the other guests. Mrs. Cresswell gasped, Mr. Drake's eyes narrowed, and Miss Vance's pen froze mid-sentence. Miss Marple, however, remained calm, her mind sifting through the new evidence. The lighter was damning, but its placement felt staged to obvious, like a prop in a village play. Someone wanted the captain to take the blame, but who? She glanced at Mrs. Grayson, whose shawl had slipped slightly, revealing a small tear at the edge. The blue silk, the rose garden, the cigarette lighter, all were threads in a tangled web. Miss Marple knew that the truth lay not in the loudest clues, but in the quiet ones, the inconsistencies that betrayed the human heart. She would need to watch closely, for the murderer was growing bold, and the next move might be even more dangerous. Chapter 7. More lies surfaced. Discovery of Captain Langley's cigarette lighter in the rose garden had cast a shadow over Greystone Hall, deepening the suspicion that clung to the guests like damp mist. By early evening, the drawing room was a cauldron of whispered accusations and guarded glances. Inspector Crawley, emboldened by his find, had taken Captain Langley aside for further questioning, leaving the others to stew in their unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner with her knitting, observed the shifting dynamics with quiet intensity, her needles clicking as steadily as a metronome. The captain's insistence that he had simply dropped his lighter during his terrace smoke rang hollow to the inspector, but Miss Marple was less convinced of his guilt. The lighter, half buried in the soil, felt too deliberate, like a breadcrumb trail laid to mislead. Her thoughts returned to the other clues: the scrap of blue silk, the crushed rose petal, the smudge on Mrs. Grayson's cuff, and Miss Vance's guarded notebook. These were the threads of truth, tangled among the lies that were now beginning to unravel. Mrs. Evelyn Cresswell, her composure fraying, broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "It's dreadful, isn't it?" she said, addressing no one in particular. "To think one of us could be a murderer. And poor Captain Langley, singled out like that. Double quotes. Mr. Julian Drake, standing by the window, turned with a faint smile. "The captain's not the only one with secrets, Mrs. Cresswell. We all have our little indiscretions, don't we?" Mrs. Cresswell's cheeks flushed, and she fanned herself vigorously. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Mr. Drake," she said, but her eyes darted away, betraying unease. Miss Marple noted the exchange, her mind flickering to their shared alibi and the widow's earlier familiarity with Drake. There was something there, perhaps an affair, perhaps something darker. She made a mental note to probe further, but her attention was drawn to Mr. Victor Grayson, who had been unusually quiet. He sat beside his wife, Diana, his hand resting possessively on hers. Mrs. Grayson's pale blue shawl, with its telltale tear, was folded neatly in her lap, as if to conceal the damage. "Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple said gently, her voice cutting through the tension, "you mentioned Sir Reginald's work with the government. Did he ever confide in you about financial troubles in St. Mary Mead? We often find that money lies at the heart of many quarrels." Grayson's eyes narrowed, but his tone remained polished. "Financial troubles? No, Miss Marple. Sir Reginald was a man of means. His concerns were political, not pecuniary." Mrs. Grayson shifted slightly, her fingers tightening on the shawl. "Victor's right," she said softly. "Reginald never spoke of money to us." Miss Marple's needles clicked on, but she noted the couple's defensiveness. Money, she knew, was a motive as old as time, and Sir Reginald's estate was vast. Had someone hoped to gain from his death? Or was the motive tied to the cryptic note about a double agent? Her thoughts were interrupted by the return of Inspector Crawley, accompanied by a flustered Captain Langley. "I've told you, Inspector," Langley said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't go near the study. That lighter must have been planted." Crawley's mustache twitched. "Planted, you say? That's a convenient excuse, Captain. We'll see what the laboratory analysis says about the lighter. Any traces of cyanide, and you'll have more explaining to do. Double quotes. Dr. Hugh Mortimer, who had been listening quietly, cleared his throat. "Inspector, if I may, cyanide leaves distinct traces. I could examine the lighter in the laboratory here. If you'd permit, it would save time." Miss Vance, standing behind him, nodded eagerly. "Dr. Mortimer's expertise would be invaluable, Inspector. He's handled such tests before." Crawley hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, Dr. Mortimer, but under police supervision." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. The scientist's offer was generous, but it also placed him conveniently close to the evidence. She recalled the bottle of potassium ferrocyanide in the laboratory. "Harmless," he'd said, but her knowledge of chemistry, gleaned from a St. Mary Mead apothecary, suggested otherwise. Could it be converted to cyanide with the right process? She resolved to consult her nephew's chemist friend at the earliest opportunity. As Dr. Mortimer and Miss Vance left with the inspector, Miss Marple turned her attention to Lady Beatrice, who was arranging a vase of roses with trembling hands. "Beatrice, dear," she said softly, "did Sir Reginald keep a safe in his study? For his government papers, perhaps?" Beatrice nodded, her eyes shadowed. "Yes, Jane. Behind the portrait of his father. He showed it to me once, but I don't know the combination." "And did anyone else know of it?" Miss Marple asked. I'm not sure," Beatrice said. "Victor might have. He and Reginald worked closely on some matters. And perhaps Dr. Mortimer, for his research funding." Miss Marple filed this away, her thoughts turning to the safe. If Sir Reginald's note about a double agent was linked to classified documents, the safe might hold the key to his suspicions and his murder. She decided to suggest a discreet inspection to the inspector, framing it as a concern for Lady Beatrice's peace of mind. Later that evening, as the guests retired to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, overhearing a heated exchange between Mr. Drake and Mrs. Cresswell near the staircase. "You promised discretion, Julian," the widow hissed, her voice low but urgent. "If they find out, they won't," Drake cut in, his tone sharp. "Keep your nerve, Evelyn." Miss Marple stepped back into the shadows, her heart quickening. The conversation confirmed her suspicions of a deeper connection, but whether it was romantic or conspiratorial remained unclear. As she made her way to her room, she passed Miss Vance's door and noticed a faint light beneath it, accompanied by the scratch of a pen. The girl was still writing, even now. The web of lies was growing thicker, with money, secrets, and betrayal weaving through the guests' stories. Miss Marple knew that the truth lay in the small inconsistencies: the torn shawl, the planted lighter, the guarded notebook. She would need to tread carefully, for the murderer was watching, and the next lie might lead her closer to danger. Chapter 8. The emotional turning point. Second evening at Greystone Hall descended with a heavy pall, the weight of Sir Reginald Harrow's murder pressing harder on the guests as the hours ticked by. The grand dining room, where they gathered for a subdued dinner, felt more like a stage for unspoken accusations than a place of hospitality. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to mirror the secrets each guest harbored. Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly between Lady Beatrice and Miss Clara Vance, observed the strained faces around the table, her knitting tucked away for the moment, her mind as sharp as ever. Inspector Crawley's investigation had intensified, fueled by the discovery of Captain Langley's cigarette lighter and Dr. Mortimer's analysis, which confirmed no cyanide traces on the lighter itself. The captain, though relieved, remained sullen, his earlier bluster replaced by a brooding silence. The inspector's attention had shifted to the safe in Sir Reginald's study, which had been opened under police supervision and revealed a cache of coded documents, government papers. Lady Beatrice confirmed, tied to Sir Reginald's covert committee work. The note about a double agent loomed larger, but no clear suspect had emerged. Miss Marple however, was more interested in the human undercurrents than the official findings. The scrap of blue silk, the crushed rose petal, Mrs. Grayson's smudged cuff, and Miss Vance's guarded notebook formed a constellation of clues. But it was the emotional cracks now appearing that drew her focus. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that truth often slipped out when nerves frayed, and tonight, the guests were on edge. Mrs. Evelyn Cresswell, her glamour dimmed by fatigue, was the first to break. As the dessert plates were cleared, she pushed back her chair with a trembling hand, her voice rising. "I can't bear this any longer," she cried, her eyes darting to Mr. Julian Drake. "All these questions, these suspicions, it's too much. I knew Sir Reginald, yes, but I had no reason to harm him. Why won't you believe me?" The room fell silent, the guests frozen. Mr. Drake's smile faltered, his hand tightening on his wine glass. "Evelyn, calm yourself," he said, his tone low but sharp. "No one's accusing you, aren't they?" She shot back, tears welling. "I saw the way you all looked at me when the inspector asked about Julian and me. Yes, we knew each other in London years ago, before my husband died. But that's all. I'm not a spy or a murderer." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was alert. Mrs. Cresswell's outburst was genuine, but it revealed more than she intended. A past with Drake, however innocent, suggested a motive: jealousy, blackmail, or a shared secret. She noted Drake's quick attempt to silence her, his composure slipping for the first time. Captain Langley, emboldened by this shift in focus, leaned forward. "If we're confessing connections," he said gruffly, "perhaps Mr. Grayson should explain his. You were thick as thieves with Sir Reginald, weren't you? All those late-night talks in the study. What were you plotting?" Mr. Victor Grayson's face tightened, his diplomatic polish cracking. "Plotting? That's rich. Coming from you, Captain. I worked with Reginald on government matters of national security, not personal gain. If anyone had a grudge, it was you. I heard you arguing with him 2 days ago, out by the stables." Langley's face reddened. "That was nothing. A disagreement about naval policy. Old history." Mrs. Diana Grayson, her hands clutching her torn blue shawl, spoke softly but firmly. "Victor, please, this isn't helping. Captain Langley, my husband trusted Sir Reginald. We all did." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Mrs. Grayson. Her defense of her husband was expected, but the tremor in her voice suggested fear not just of the situation, but of something specific. The shawl, the rose garden, the smudge of dirt, these were no coincidences. Mrs. Grayson was hiding something, and Miss Marple suspected it was more personal than political. Lady Beatrice, seated beside Miss Marple, whispered, "Jane, this is dreadful. They're turning on each other like wolves." "Indeed, dear," Miss Marple replied softly. "But wolves, when cornered, often reveal their true natures." As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, catching Miss Vance's eye. The young woman was clutching her notebook, her face pale. "Miss Vance," Miss Marple said kindly, "you look troubled. This must be hard, working so closely with Dr. Mortimer. Did you know Sir Reginald well?" Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the notebook. "Not really, Miss Marple. I just assisted Dr. Mortimer. Sir Reginald funded his research, but they argued sometimes. About money, I think." "Money?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, encouraging. "In St. Mary Mead, we find that money often stirs strong feelings." Clara's eyes darted away. It was nothing serious, just disagreements over funding. Dr. Mortimer needed more for his experiments, and Sir Reginald was cautious. Miss Marple nodded, but her mind seized on the admission. A financial dispute could be a motive, especially for a scientist with access to chemicals like those in the laboratory. She made a mental note to revisit the East Wing, perhaps to examine Dr. Mortimer's records. As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple approached Inspector Crawley, who was reviewing notes in the library. "Inspector," she said mildly, "have you considered the safe's contents? Those coded documents, might they point to who Sir Reginald feared?" Crawley sighed, clearly exasperated by her persistence. "We're decoding them now, Miss Marple, but they're government business, not for civilians. If there's a double agent, we'll find them." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But in my village, we often find that. The smallest detail, a torn shawl. A misplaced lighter reveals the heart of the matter." Crawley grunted, dismissing her. But Miss Marple was undeterred. The emotional outbursts had confirmed her suspicions. The guests were entangled in a web of personal and professional betrayals. Mrs. Cresswell's past with Drake, Langley's argument with Sir Reginald, Grayson's secrecy, and Clara's nervous revelations all pointed to motives deeper than espionage. The truth was close, but it required one more push-a-trap to force the murderer's hand. As she retired to her room, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the rose garden, where the clues had first appeared. Tomorrow, she would suggest a gathering there, under the guise of calming the guests. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that truth often surfaced when people were caught off guard, and she intended to set the stage for just such a moment. Chapter 9. The trap. Third morning at Greystone Hall dawned with a deceptive calm. The Dorset countryside bathed in a soft mist that clung to the rose garden and the manor's ivy-clad walls. Inside, the guests were restless, their nerves frayed by 2 days of suspicion and Inspector Crawley's relentless questioning. Miss Jane Marple, however, remained serene, her knitting a constant companion as she sat in the drawing room, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The emotional outbursts of the previous evening, Mrs. Cresswell's tearful confession, Captain Langley's defensive bluster, Miss Vance's hesitant revelation had convinced her that the murderer was growing careless. It was time, she decided, to set a trap. Miss Marple had spent the early morning with Lady Beatrice, discussing the rose garden's beauty as a pretext for her plan. "Beatrice, dear," she said over breakfast, her voice carrying just enough to reach the other guests, "I find the garden so soothing. Perhaps we might all take a walk there this afternoon. It would do us good to clear our minds." Lady Beatrice, catching the glint in her friend's eye, agreed readily. "A splendid idea, Jane. I'll arrange it for after lunch. The roses are in full bloom." The suggestion was met with lukewarm enthusiasm from the guests, but none refused outright. Miss Marple noted their reactions, Captain Langley's scowl, Mrs. Cresswell's nervous glance at Mr. Drake, Mr. Grayson's tight-lipped nod, and Mrs. Grayson's fleeting look of unease as she adjusted her blue shawl, its torn edge now carefully folded inward. Miss Clara Vance clutched her notebook, her face pale, while Dr. Mortimer adjusted his spectacles. Muttering about pollen allergies, Inspector Crawley, informed of the plan, saw no harm in it. "As long as everyone stays in sight," he said, gruffly. "We're still waiting on the decoded documents from Sir Reginald's safe. They might tell us who this double agent was." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course, Inspector. But sometimes a simple walk reveals more than papers ever could." By 2 o'clock, the guests gathered in the rose garden, a secluded enclave bordered by high yew hedges and fragrant blooms. The study window, with its telltale scuff mark and crushed petal, was visible just beyond the hedge. Miss Marple, leaning on Lady Beatrice's arm, guided the group toward it, her steps deliberate. "Such a lovely spot," she said, her voice carrying. "Sir Reginald must have loved it here. So private, yet so close to the house. Mrs. Diana Grayson paused, her hand brushing a rose. "It's beautiful," she said softly, but her eyes darted to the study window, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her fingers. Captain Langley, lighting a cigarette, snorted. "Private to private. If you ask me, perfect place for someone to sneak about, unseen." Mr. Julian Drake, standing near Mrs. Cresswell, raised an eyebrow. "Sneaking, Captain? That's a strong word, though I suppose you'd know, with your lighter found so conveniently nearby." Langley's face reddened, but before he could retort, Miss Marple spoke, her tone gentle but pointed. "Indeed, Captain, your lighter was a curious find. But I wonder, did anyone else notice the window last night? It was open, you know, and there's a mark on the sill, as if someone climbed through." The group froze, eyes turning to the window. Mrs. Grayson's hand tightened on her shawl, and Miss Vance's notebook slipped slightly in her grasp. Dr. Mortimer cleared his throat. "A mark? Probably just wear and tear. This is an old house, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But there's also a scrap of fabric blue silk, I believe caught on a thorn just there." She pointed to the rose bush beneath the window, where the police had overlooked the tiny clue. Mrs. Grayson gasped, a sound so faint it might have gone unnoticed, but Miss Marple heard it. "Mrs. Grayson," she said kindly, "you're so fond of the garden. Did you walk here last night? Perhaps before your headache?" Mrs. Grayson's face paled. No, I told you. I was in my room with Victor." Mr. Grayson stepped forward, his voice sharp. "My wife was unwell, Miss Marple. Leave her be." Miss Marple nodded, her expression disarming, but her words carried weight. "Of course, Mr. Grayson, but in St. Mary Mead, we find that small things, a torn shawl, a smudge of dirt, often tell a story. And Sir Reginald's note about a double agent suggests someone close to him was not what they seemed." The air grew thick with tension. Mrs. Cresswell clutched Drake's arm, her voice trembling. "This is madness. Are we all to be accused now?" "Not accused, dear," Miss Marple said softly. "Merely observed. Someone here placed cyanide in Sir Reginald's glass, and I believe they passed through this garden to do it." Miss Vance, her face flushed, spoke suddenly. "You're wrong, Miss Marple. The cyanide could have come from the laboratory," Dr. Mortimer said. "Clara." Dr. Mortimer snapped, his voice cutting her off. "That's enough." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The girl's outburst, and her employer's sharp rebuke, confirmed her suspicion that the laboratory held more than scientific secrets. She turned to Inspector Crawley, who had been watching silently. "Inspector, might we examine the laboratory again? Miss Vance's notes could be illuminating, don't you think?" Crawley frowned but nodded. "Very well, but no one touches anything." As the group returned to the house, Miss Marple lingered by the rose bush, her fingers brushing the thorn where the blue silk had caught. The trap was set, and the guests' reactions had revealed their cracks. Mrs. Grayson's fear, Miss Vance's slip, Dr. Mortimer's unease. The murderer was feeling the pressure, and Miss Marple knew that the next move would be telling. She would need to watch closely, for the truth was nearer, and danger nearer still. Chapter 10. The revealed atmosphere in Greystone Hall's library was taut as a bowstring, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the oak-paneled walls. The guests, summoned by Inspector Crawley after Miss Marple's subtle maneuvering, in the rose garden, stood or sat in uneasy silence, their faces a mosaic of apprehension and defiance. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner with her knitting folded neatly in her lap, appeared as unassuming as ever, but her sharp blue eyes gleamed with the quiet certainty of one who had unraveled a knot. The time had come to lay bare the truth. Inspector Crawley, his notebook open, addressed the room with a gruff authority. "We've examined the laboratory, as Miss Marple suggested," he said, his mustache twitching. "No cyanide was found, but Miss Vance's notes contained irregularities, coded entries, not just scientific data. We're decoding them now, but it's clear someone here knows more than they've let on." Miss Clara Vance, her face pale, clutched her notebook tightly. "They're just shorthand," she protested, "for Dr. Mortimer's work." Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, cut through the tension. "Miss Vance, dear, in St. Mary Mead, we often find that codes hide more than they reveal. But let us set that aside for a moment. I believe we can resolve this matter by considering the simplest facts." The guests turned to her, some with skepticism, others with unease. Captain Langley snorted, his cigarette case clicking nervously. "Facts? The fact is, someone poisoned Sir Reginald, and that lighter was meant to frame me." "Quite so, Captain," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "But the lighter was too obvious, don't you think? A clumsy attempt to shift blame." "No, the real clues are smaller, quieter. A crushed rose petal, a scrap of blue silk, a smudge of dirt. They tell a story of someone who moved through the rose garden to the study window, someone who knew Sir Reginald's habits and had access to his brandy." Mrs. Diana Grayson's hands tightened on her torn blue shawl, her face ashen. Mr. Victor Grayson stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Miss Marple, this is speculation. My wife was in our room, as I told the inspector." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, Mr. Grayson. But let us consider the sequence of events. Sir Reginald was poisoned at approximately 9:47 p.m., as Dr. Mortimer's watch confirmed. The cyanide was in his brandy glass, not the decanter, suggesting a precise act. The study window was open, with a scuff mark on the sill and a rose petal crushed beneath. A scrap of blue silk matching Mrs. Grayson's shawl was caught on a thorn. And Mrs. Grayson, you were seen in the garden before dinner, alone." Mrs. Grayson's eyes widened. I told you. I had a headache. I was in my room." Miss Marple continued, undeterred. "Yet your cuff bore a smudge of dirt, dear, and your shawl is torn. Small things, but telling. I believe you slipped out to the garden after dinner, climbed through the study window, and placed cyanide in Sir Reginald's glass. You knew he would drink alone, as was his habit." The room erupted in gasps. Mrs. Cresswell clutched Mr. Drake's arm, and Captain Langley's cigarette fell to the floor. Mr. Grayson's face darkened. "This is outrageous." "Diana would never let her finish," Inspector Crawley said, his eyes narrowing. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "The motive, I suspect, was not espionage, despite Sir Reginald's note about a double agent. That was a distraction, a fear born of his government work. No, this was personal. Mrs. Grayson, you and Sir Reginald had a history, did you? Not a financial arrangement, perhaps, tied to your husband's career. Sir Reginald held influence over Mr. Grayson's position in the Foreign Office, and he was threatening to expose something a scandal that would ruin you both." Mrs. Grayson's composure shattered. She stood, her shawl falling to the floor, and her voice trembled. "You're wrong. I cared for Reginald, but he was cruel. He held a loan over Victor's head, demanded payments we couldn't afford. He threatened to tell everyone, to destroy us, Diana." Mr. Grayson hissed, but she pressed on, tears streaming. "I didn't mean to kill him," she sobbed. "I only wanted to frighten him, to make him stop. I took the cyanide from the laboratory. It was just a powder. I thought it would make him ill. I climbed through the window, put it in his glass, I didn't know it would kill him. The room fell silent, the confession hanging heavy. Inspector Crawley stepped forward, his face grim. Mrs. Diana Grayson, you're under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Harrow. As the constable led her away, Mr. Grayson followed, his face a mask of shock and despair. Mrs. Cresswell buried her face in her hands, and Mr. Drake's expression was unreadable. Captain Langley muttered, "Good God," while Dr. Mortimer and Miss Vance exchanged uneasy glances. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her expression somber. "A tragedy, Inspector," she said softly. "In St. Mary Mead, we see such things too often, fear and desperation driving good people to terrible acts." Crawley nodded, grudging respect in his eyes. "You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple. That shawl and the garden, how did you know?" "Small things, Inspector," she said. "They always tell the truth, if you listen." As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple remained, her thoughts already turning to the aftermath. The truth had been revealed, but the cost was heavy, and she knew the ripples of this crime would linger at Greystone Hall. Chapter 11. The reflection the morning after Mrs. Diana Grayson's confession cast a somber hush over Greystone Hall, as if the manor itself were mourning the unraveling of its secrets. The rose garden, once a place of quiet beauty, now seemed a silent witness to the tragedy, its blooms drooping under the weight of the mist that lingered in the Dorset air. The guests, no longer confined by Inspector Crawley's orders, moved about with a subdued air, their conversations muted and their glances wary. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing room with her knitting, felt the weight of the resolution, her sharp blue eyes softened by a quiet sadness. Lady Beatrice, her face etched with grief for her brother and the betrayal within her home, joined Miss Marple by the window. "Jane, dear," she said, her voice low, "how did you see it so clearly? Diana seemed so gentle. I never imagined her capable of such a thing." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a comforting rhythm in the stillness. "In St. Mary Mead, Beatrice, we learned that gentleness can mask desperation. Mrs. Grayson was trapped by debt, by fear, by a man who held power over her husband's future. It's a sad truth that fear can drive even the kindest soul to darkness." The other guests had begun to depart, their bags packed and their alibis no longer needed. Captain Arthur Langley, his cigarette case now still, offered a gruff nod to Miss Marple as he left for the train, his relief at being cleared tempered by the shadow of suspicion. Mrs. Evelyn Cresswell, her glamour restored but her eyes haunted, bid a tearful farewell to Lady Beatrice, avoiding Mr. Julian Drake's gaze. Drake himself slipped away quietly, his charming smile absent, his role in the affair still ambiguous to all but Miss Marple, who suspected his connection to Mrs. Cresswell was more than social, but irrelevant to the crime. Dr. Hugh Mortimer and Miss Clara Vance lingered longer, their professional partnership strained by the scrutiny of Clara's notebook. The coded entries, as Inspector Crawley later confirmed, were indeed scientific notes, but they hinted at disagreements over funding that echoed Mrs. Grayson's motive. "Dr. Mortimer," Miss Marple said gently as he prepared to leave, "you must be relieved this is over. Your work can continue now, I trust." Mortimer adjusted his spectacles, his face weary. "Yes, Miss Marple. Though I fear Sir Reginald's death will delay our funding." He was difficult, but generous. Miss Vance, standing beside him, clutched her notebook tightly. "Thank you, Miss Marple," she said, her voice hesitant. "You made us all think twice about what we hide." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Secrets, my dear, have a way of revealing themselves. It's best to live simply, as we do in St. Mary Mead." Inspector Crawley, overseeing the final police procedures, approached Miss Marple with a rare look of respect. "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple," he said, his mustache twitching. "That shawl, the rose petal, you saw what we missed. Ever thought of joining the force?" Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, Inspector, I'm far too old for that. But I find that a little observation and a touch of understanding goes a long way. People are much the same, whether in a village or a grand house like this." As the inspector left to finalize his report, Miss Marple turned her thoughts to the broader implications of the case. Sir Reginald's note about a double agent had been a red herring, born of his paranoia about his government work. The true motive was simpler, more human, a woman driven to desperation by financial ruin and coercion. Yet Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that the coded documents in the safe held secrets of their own secrets that might never be fully unraveled. She rose, gathering her knitting, and joined Lady Beatrice for a final walk in the rose garden. The air was cooler now, the mist lifting to reveal the vibrant blooms. "Jane," Beatrice said, pausing by the study window, "will you stay a few days? I feel so lost without Reginald." "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said, patting her friend's hand. "But you'll find your strength. Greystone Hall has weathered storms before, and so have you." As they stood by the rose bush where the blue silk had caught, Miss Marple's mind wandered to her village, where small betrayals and quiet truths were not so different from those at Greystone. "Life is a puzzle, Beatrice," she said softly. "We piece it together as best we can, with patience and care." With a final glance at the window, Miss Marple turned back toward the house, her work here done. The murderer had been unmasked, the truth laid bare, but her heart carried the weight of human frailty, a burden she knew well from the lanes of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 12. A lingering doubt. The quiet of Greystone Hall, restored after Mrs. Diana Grayson's arrest, was deceptive, like the calm surface of a pond hiding currents beneath. Miss Jane Marple, lingering at the manor at Lady Beatrice's request, sensed an unfinished thread in the tapestry of the case. Though the murder of Sir Reginald Harrow had been solved, the cryptic note about a double agent and the coded documents in his safe nagged at her. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that a single loose thread could unravel a larger truth, and her instincts told her that Greystone still held secrets. The morning was bright, the Dorset sun filtering through the drawing room's tall windows, where Miss Marple sat with her knitting, her eyes occasionally drifting to the remaining guests. Most had departed, but Dr. Hugh Mortimer and Miss Clara Vance lingered, citing unfinished business with Sir Reginald's estate. Mr. Julian Drake, too, had delayed his departure, claiming a need to settle matters with Lady Beatrice. Miss Marple noted their presence with interest, her mind circling back to the laboratory and Miss Vance's coded notebook. Lady Beatrice joined her, her face less strained but still shadowed by grief. "Jane, you've been a godsend," she said, settling into a chair. "But I can't shake the feeling that there's more to Reginald's death. Those documents in the safe, do you think Diana was truly the end of it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "My dear Beatrice, Mrs. Grayson's confession was genuine, but it was driven by personal desperation, not espionage. Yet Sir Reginald's fears of a double agent suggest a broader game. I wonder if we might take another look at those documents or perhaps Miss Vance's notes." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Clara's notes, you think she's involved?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "But young people often see more than they say. Her notebook may hold clues she doesn't even realize are important." After a light luncheon, Miss Marple proposed a visit to the East Wing laboratory, ostensibly to retrieve a shawl she claimed to have left there. Dr. Mortimer, ever the scientist, agreed to escort her, with Miss Vance trailing reluctantly behind. The laboratory was as cluttered as before, its shelves lined with bottles and equipment. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the scene, pausing on a small ledger tucked among Dr. Mortimer's papers, a detail she hadn't noticed earlier. "Dr. Mortimer," she said, her voice mild, "you mentioned Sir Reginald funded your research. Did he ever review your accounts in St. Mary Mead? We find that benefactors often keep a close eye on their investments." Mortimer adjusted his spectacles, his expression guarded. "He did, occasionally. But my work was sound agricultural compounds, nothing sinister." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her gaze drifting to the ledger. "Might I see that book? I do so enjoy numbers. They tell such clear stories." Miss Vance, standing nearby, stiffened, but Mortimer handed over the ledger with a shrug. Miss Marple flipped through it, her sharp eyes catching discrepancies, entries for chemicals that didn't match the laboratory's inventory, and sums far larger than typical research. Expenses. One entry, dated a week before Sir Reginald's death, noted a payment to an unnamed recipient. Marked only with the initials J.D. Curious, Miss Marple murmured, closing the ledger. "Dr. Mortimer, do you know a J.D.? Perhaps someone connected to your work?" Mortimer's face paled slightly. "J.D., no. It must be a supplier. I'll check my records." Miss Vance's hands twitched, her notebook clutched tightly. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Miss Vance, your notes must be invaluable to Dr. Mortimer. Might I glance at them?" Just to see how a young scientist organizes her thoughts, Clara hesitated, then handed over the notebook, her eyes darting to Mortimer. Miss Marple flipped through the pages, noting the shorthand dense, but not impenetrable. Among the scientific jargon were cryptic references to meetings and deliveries, with dates matching the ledger's entries. One phrase stood out: "J.D. confirms midnight drop." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. "Thank you, dear," she said, returning the notebook. "You're very thorough." As they left the laboratory, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mr. Julian Drake. His initials, his late arrival, his evasive charm pointed to a role beyond that of a casual guest. She recalled his whispered conversation with Mrs. Cresswell, hinting at a shared secret. Was he the double agent Sir Reginald feared, or merely a profiteer exploiting the scientist's work? That evening, Miss Marple joined Lady Beatrice in the library, where Mr. Drake was discussing estate matters. "Mr. Drake," she said softly, "you've been most helpful to Beatrice. Your work abroad, does it involve scientific research, by any chance?" Drake's smile was smooth. "Not directly, Miss Marple. I deal in information trade, politics, that sort of thing." "Of course," she said, her eyes twinkling. "But information can be valuable, especially when it concerns chemicals or government secrets." Drake's smile faltered, and Miss Marple knew she had struck a nerve. The ledger, the notebook, the initials, they pointed to a scheme that Sir Reginald had uncovered, one that may have contributed to his paranoia and, indirectly, his death. Mrs. Grayson's act was personal, but the shadow of a larger betrayal loomed as she retired to her room. Miss Marple resolved to share her findings with Inspector Crawley. The murder was solved, but the question of the double agent remained, and she suspected Mr. Drake held the key. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that truth often came in layers, and she was determined to peel back this final one. Chapter 13. The second trapped fourth day at Greystone Hall brought a restless energy, as if the manor itself were impatient for its remaining secrets to be laid bare. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing room with her knitting, felt the weight of the unresolved thread she had uncovered, the cryptic entries in Dr. Mortimer's ledger, and Miss Clara Vance's notebook, both pointing to the mysterious J.D. Almost certainly Mr. Julian Drake. Mrs. Diana Grayson's confession had solved the murder of Sir Reginald Harrow, but the specter of a double agent, hinted at in Sir Reginald's note, suggested a deeper conspiracy. Miss Marple, ever methodical, knew that a second trap was needed to expose the truth. The morning passed quietly, with Lady Beatrice overseeing preparations for the guests' final departures. Dr. Hugh Mortimer and Miss Vance were packing their equipment, while Mr. Drake lingered, citing a need to finalize business with the estate. Miss Marple observed him closely, noting his guarded charm and the way his eyes darted toward Miss Vance whenever she spoke. The connection between them was subtle but undeniable, and Miss Marple suspected it was tied to the coded documents in Sir Reginald's safe. After luncheon, Miss Marple approached Inspector Crawley, who was reviewing the decoded government papers in the library. "Inspector," she said, her voice mild, "have you made progress with Sir Reginald's documents? I wonder if they mention any transactions, perhaps with someone whose initials are JD." Crawley's mustache twitched, his skepticism tempered by respect for her earlier insights. "JD? The documents are mostly reports on trade routes sensitive, but not incriminating. No initials stand out." "Why do you ask?" "In St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling, "we find that small details like initials in a ledger often point to larger truths. Might I suggest a small gathering this evening to put the guests at ease before they leave? It could clarify matters." Crawley frowned but nodded. "Very well, Miss Marple, but no theatrics. This case is closed, save for the paperwork." Miss Marple smiled faintly and sought out Lady Beatrice to arrange an informal tea in the library, where the safe's contents could be subtly discussed. She had a plan not as dramatic as her confrontation in the rose garden, but equally precise. By bringing the remaining suspects together, she could apply just enough pressure to provoke a reaction. At 5 o'clock, the library was arranged, with teacups and a silver tray, the atmosphere deceptively cozy. Dr. Mortimer, Miss Vance, and Mr. Drake joined Lady Beatrice and Miss Marple, their polite smiles masking unease. Inspector Crawley stood by the door, his presence a reminder of the unresolved questions. Miss Marple, pouring tea with a steady hand, began her trap. "Dr. Mortimer," she said gently, "your work must be fascinating. Those agricultural compounds did Sir Reginald ever question their use? I noticed a ledger in the laboratory, with entries for rather large sums. One was marked JD, a supplier, perhaps." Mortimer's spectacles glinted as he shifted uncomfortably. "Suppliers, yes. Routine expenses. Sir Reginald approved them." Miss Vance, her notebook absent for once, fidgeted with her teacup. "The ledger's just for tracking costs," she said quickly. "Nothing unusual." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Mr. Drake. "And you, Mr. Drake? Your work in information, does it involve scientific suppliers? I understand you and Sir Reginald discussed business abroad, perhaps related to Dr. Mortimer's research." Drake's smile was tight. "My dealings were with Sir Reginald alone, Miss Marple. Trade matters, not science." "I'm not sure what you're implying." "Oh, nothing, dear," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. "But Sir Reginald's note about a double agent was curious. And those coded entries in Miss Vance's notebook, JD confirms midnight drop, made me wonder if information was being traded, perhaps for profit." Miss Vance gasped, her teacup rattling in its saucer. "That's not true. My notes are private scientific observations." Dr. Mortimer's face reddened. "Miss Marple, this is outrageous. Clara's notes are from my research, nothing more." "But," Mr. Drake's composure cracked. He stood abruptly, his voice sharp. "Enough of this. I came to Greystone at Sir Reginald's invitation, not to be accused of whatever you're suggesting. If you'll excuse me, "Sit down, Mr. Drake," Inspector Crawley said, stepping forward. Miss Marple's raised a point. "We've decoded more of the safe's documents, and one mentions a payment to a JD for sensitive information. Care to explain?" Drake's eyes darted to Miss Vance, who looked away, her hands trembling. Miss Marple's needles, now in her lap, were still, her voice calm but relentless. "Mr. Drake, I believe you were selling Sir Reginald's government secrets perhaps through Dr. Mortimer's research, which provided a convenient cover. Miss Vance's notes recorded your transactions, didn't they? Not espionage in the grand sense, but a profitable betrayal." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Miss Vance's resolve broke first. "I didn't know it was wrong," she cried, tears welling. "Mr. Drake asked me to pass messages about the research, the chemicals. He said it was for funding, to help Dr. Mortimer." Clara, Mortimer snapped, but his own face betrayed guilt. I suspected Drake was diverting funds, but I needed his contacts. Sir Reginald was cutting my budget. I had no choice." Drake's charm vanished, his voice cold. "You've no proof, Miss Marple. This is all conjecture." Inspector Crawley stepped forward, holding a decoded document. "Not quite, Mr. Drake. This confirms payments to you, funneled through a shell company. You're coming with me for questioning." As Drake was led away, Miss Vance sobbing and Mortimer slumped in defeat, Miss Marple sighed softly. The murder was solved, but the betrayal ran deeper. A web of greed and opportunism that Sir Reginald had suspected, but never lived to expose. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such human failings before, and they always left a bitter taste. Chapter 14. The web unraveled revelation of Mr. Julian Drake's scheme, with Miss Clara Vance and Dr. Hugh Mortimer as reluctant accomplices, had lifted the final veil of secrecy from Greystone Hall. The library, where the confrontation had unfolded, now felt less like a battleground and more like a place of quiet reckoning. The evening light filtered through the tall windows, casting a soft glow on the oak-paneled walls. But the air remained heavy with the aftermath of betrayal. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner with her knitting, observed the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, her sharp blue eyes reflecting the complexity of human nature. Lady Beatrice, pale but resolute, sat beside Miss Marple, her hands clasped tightly. "Jane," she whispered, "I can scarcely believe it. Reginald suspected treachery, but to think it was happening under our roof. And poor Clara, caught up in it all." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a steady counterpoint to the tension. "My dear Beatrice, greed and fear are powerful motivators." Mr. Drake saw an opportunity in Dr. Mortimer's desperation and Miss Vance's naivety. Sir Reginald's death was a separate tragedy, driven by Mrs. Grayson's despair, but his suspicions of a double agent were not entirely unfounded. Inspector Crawley, overseeing the final interviews, had taken Mr. Drake into custody, with Miss Vance and Dr. Mortimer agreeing to cooperate in exchange for leniency. The decoded documents from Sir Reginald's safe, now fully analyzed, revealed a pattern of payments to Drake, funneled through a fictitious supplier linked to Dr. Mortimer's research. The sensitive information Drake sold was not state secrets, as Sir Reginald had feared, but proprietary chemical formulas from Mortimer's work, which Drake marketed to foreign investors for profit. Miss Vance's coded notes, intended to track research progress, had inadvertently documented the transactions, her shorthand masking their true nature. As the inspector finalized his report, Miss Marple turned her attention to the remaining clues. ENDS Mrs. Evelyn Cresswell's connection to Drake, hinted at in their whispered exchange, had been clarified through quiet inquiries to Lady Beatrice. "They met years ago in London," Beatrice confided. "A flirtation, nothing more." Evelyn was flattered by his attention, but she knew nothing of his schemes. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. Mrs. Cresswell's nervous defense of Drake had been born of sentiment, not complicity or distraction, but not a motive. Captain Langley, cleared of murder but shaken by the ordeal, had already left for London, his cigarette case no longer a symbol of guilt, but a reminder of how easily suspicion could be manipulated. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her bag, and joined Lady Beatrice for a final walk through the rose garden. The air was cool, the blooms vibrant despite the shadow of recent events. "Beatrice," she said gently, "Greystone will recover, as will you. Sir Reginald's work, though tainted by betrayal, was honorable, and his legacy will endure." Beatrice's eyes glistened. "Thanks to you, Jane. You saw what none of us could, those small things, the petal, the shawl, the ledger. How do you do it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "In St. Mary Mead, we learn to listen to the quiet things, the whispers of the heart, the truths hidden in plain sight. People are much the same, whether in a village or a grand house." As they paused by the study window, where the scuff mark and crushed petal had first caught her eye, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the human cost of the case. Mrs. Grayson's desperation, Drake's greed, Miss Vance's innocence. Mortimer's compromise, all were threads in a tapestry of frailty. The double agent, in the end, was not a spy but a profiteer, and Sir Reginald's paranoia had been both his shield and his downfall. "Will you stay another day?" Jane's Beatrice asked, her voice hopeful. "I think I must return to St. Mary Mead," Miss Marple said kindly. "My garden needs tending, and I've a letter to write to my nephew's chemist friend about those compounds. But you'll write to me, won't you?" Beatrice nodded, managing a smile. As they turned back toward the house, Miss Marple cast a final glance at the rose garden, its beauty undimmed by the secrets it had held. The web was unraveled, the truth exposed, but the lessons of Greystone Hall would linger in her mind, a reminder of the delicate balance between trust and betrayal. Chapter 15. The quiet departure of the morning of Miss Jane Marple's departure from Greystone Hall was marked by a serene stillness, as if the manor had exhaled its burdens at last. The Dorset countryside sparkled under a clear August sky, the rose gardens blooms standing proud despite the secrets they had witnessed. Inside, the grand hall was quiet, the remaining staff moving with a subdued efficiency as they prepared for Lady Beatrice to carry on without her brother. Miss Marple, her small suitcase packed and her knitting bag slung over her arm, stood by the front door, ready to return to St. Mary Mead. Lady Beatrice, her eyes still shadowed, but her demeanor stronger, clasped Miss Marple's hands warmly. "Jane, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "You've brought clarity to this dreadful affair, not just for Reginald's murder, but for the betrayal that surrounded him. I feel I can face the future now." Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled with quiet warmth. "My dear Beatrice, you've always had the strength. Greystone Hall is yours to steward, and I've no doubt you'll do so with grace. In St. Mary Mead, we find that time heals even the deepest wounds, if we let it." The resolution of the case had left its mark on all who remained. Mrs. Diana Grayson's confession to poisoning Sir Reginald Harrow, driven by desperation to escape his financial hold over her husband, had closed the murder investigation. Mr. Julian Drake's arrest for selling proprietary chemical formulas, facilitated by Dr. Hugh Mortimer's compromised research, and Miss Clara Vance's unwitting cooperation had unraveled the secondary plot of betrayal. The coded documents in Sir Reginald's safe, once thought to signal espionage, revealed only a scheme of greed, a far cry from the grand conspiracy of a double agent. but no less damaging dot as Miss Marple waited for the car to take her to the station. She reflected on the human frailties that had woven the tragedy. Mrs. Grayson's fear, Drake's opportunism, Mortimer's ambition, Vance's naivety, all were familiar to her from the quiet lanes of her village. The clues: the crushed rose petal, the torn blue shawl, the smudged cuff. The cryptic ledger had been small, but in her hands, they had told a story as clear as any in St. Mary Mead. Inspector Crawley, who had stopped by to finalize his report, approached with a rare smile. "Miss Marple, you've made my job easier and harder," he said, his mustache twitching. "I'll not underestimate a village spinster again. Those details you spotted: the silk, the petal." They cracked the case wide open. Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Oh, Inspector, I'm no detective, just an old woman who notices things. People are much the same everywhere, you know. They leave their truths in the little things they overlook." Crawley tipped his hat, and as he turned to leave, Miss Marple caught sight of Mr. Perkins, the butler, polishing a silver tray in the hall. His hands, once trembling, were steady now, his loyalty to Greystone unshaken by the turmoil. "Mr. Perkins," she called gently, "you've been a pillar through this storm. Sir Reginald would have been proud." Perkins bowed slightly, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you, madam. It's been a trial, but we'll carry on." The car arrived, and Lady Beatrice walked Miss Marple to the door, her arm linked through her friend's. "You'll come back, Jane?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "Greystone will always have a place for you." "Of course, dear," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "And you must visit St. Mary Mead. The roses there are quite lovely, though perhaps less eventful." As the car rolled down the drive, Miss Marple glanced back at Greystone Hall, its Georgian facade gleaming in the sunlight. The case was closed, the betrayals exposed, but her thoughts lingered on the human heart's capacity for error and its potential for redemption. She would write to her nephew's chemist friend about the laboratory compounds, just to be thorough. But for now, her work was done. Settling back in her seat, Miss Marple opened her knitting bag, her needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The train to St. Mary Mead awaited, and with it, the quiet life she cherished, a life where mysteries, though smaller, were no less profound. As the manor faded from view, she smiled faintly, ready to return to her garden and the simple truths of home.